Up next, we have Dr. Newitt, who did his PhD in developmental psychology at UBC in Vancouver, and I mean Vancouver this time. Unlike before, where I had my typical Vancouverite slip. His research interests focus on social and moral decision making. He's currently a college professor at Okanagan College, teaching introductory psychology, child development, and research methods. His sort of personal professional interests are in developmental psychopathology and critical thinking, and he teaches critical thinking to his students, whether they like it or not.
They like it mostly.
Well, I'm sure. You seem very delightful. Anyway, please join me in welcoming Dr. Newitt.
Great. So I'm going to try and make this as brief as I can, given that we're over time. But I have to start off by a slight digression. So obviously, I come at this issue from a different perspective from most of the speakers that we've already seen. I'm not starting off at the vaccination side. I actually started off at the autism side, and I was teaching an infancy class at UBC in Vancouver, and I was talking about social development and social cognition and talking about autism. And a student in class brought up the Wakefield study, the study that was mentioned earlier, linking the MMR vaccine with autism. I kind of laughed and went home and made up a lecture looking at the research, went back to class and talked about it, and thought that I was done with it. And the next day, or 2 days later, I was at a park by my house. And it's a destination park where parents come from all over and bring their kids and play on all the big slides and stuff. And I was minding my own business with my kid. And there was a woman standing up on a bench in the park giving what was essentially an anti-vaccine sermon to all of these parents. And I was trying to mind my own business. I was trying to mind my own business, playing with my kid, just, you know, ignore them, for instance. Ignore them, they can't hurt you. And then I snapped. And I told her what she was arguing with, like, a kid in here? Bullshit. And I launched into my lecture and went on for 35 minutes, apparently. And essentially, intellectually beat her down. And it wasn't my proudest moment, but it was something that I sort of felt that I had to do. And it was funny, because as I was walking away, and my child was hiding between my legs the whole time I was doing it, Daddy, Dad. And so I had to leave the park after that. It was like doing the walk of shame after you've lost your temper. And as I was walking by a big wooden train, there were two women with their little kids laughing. And that's how they're like, where do you teach? And I was like, what are you talking about? That was so a lecture. I teach at UBC. And they were both faculty members from the Department of Immunology at UBC Vancouver. They laughed at me and said, your boiling point's 2 degrees lower than ours, because we were about to say something and you exploded. So I took an interest in the vaccine autism movement at that point. And I introduced it in all of my intro psych classes when I talk about critical thinking. Critical thinking is a buzzword in post-secondary education. We all talk about it. It's in all of our course syllabi. And for many people, the last time they talk about it is when it's in the course syllabi, right? And then they continue on with their course and indoctrinate people to believe whatever it is that they believe. I really do try to get people to think critically about things and challenge their beliefs and expectations of things. And I use the anti-vaccine movement as a case study and sort of illustrate the erroneous thinking that underlies this approach and how, if we apply our reasoning skills and use evidence to make our decisions, we can come to better decisions. So I had to have a picture of Andy Wakefield and his enabler wife up there because really they got the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, autism thing started. There's no way that I can describe all of the different errors in reasoning that underlie the vaccine autism link in one 15-minute talk, even if I go over. There's no way that I can do it. There's just too many of them. So I had to try to cherry pick some of the reasoning biases and sort of anti-vaccine themes that we see commonly discussed on the internet, which is not the information superhighway. It's, you know, a dark pit of deceit and despair. It is. If you type in autism into Google, you get the age of autism, which is the hive of stupid. Sorry. So I'm just going to do a little introduction, and when I talk about the anti-vaccine stuff and talk about these cognitive biases, I'm not suggesting that people who are anti-vaccine are stupid. Right? We all have basic cognitive biases, right? The world is, well, our world is really complex, and in order to make sense of it, we have to take cognitive shortcuts, right? And those cognitive shortcuts sometimes lead us to make errors, right? It's a reality of our existence. And they've been intensively studied in psychology and philosophy and cognitive sciences. There's a long history of these. So I'm not impugning the people who believe in the link between vaccination and other diseases as being stupid. Ignorant might be a more appropriate term. And ignorant doesn't mean stupid either. Ignorant means uninformed. And talks like what we're going through today are a perfect avenue for helping to inform people about the realities of vaccination in terms of the risks and benefits. So I had to figure out which biases I was going to talk about. So what I did was I looked at a study by Nicholson and Leask, who were studying the anti-vaccine movement on the internet. And so what they did was they were analyzing discussion forums and trying to identify the different themes that were cropping up in these discussions. And so the three most common themes that they identified were alleged adverse effects of immunization, the alleged link to autism, and then the ingredients of vaccines. So loosely speaking, this is the framework that sort of shaped what I'm going to say. So you've heard this one before already today, the natural fallacy. It's sometimes referred to as biophilia in the decision-making literature. It's this seemingly universal bias towards natural things. You can take distilled water and add minerals back to it and make it exactly the same as the stuff the Vital Waters people are selling you, right? But if you ask everyone in the general population, a vast majority of them will say that the Vital Waters stuff is better because that's naturally occurring chemicals in it. Chemically, they're exactly the same. There's no difference. The process in making them is slightly different. And so the researcher who's really big in this in the decision-making area is a guy named Rosen. And he's done numerous studies looking at how people perceive water and tomatoes and all sorts of different products. And this natural fallacy seems to be a general human bias. It's, well, I shouldn't say human, North American and Western European bias. We seem to be biased towards natural products. So we see this in advertising campaigns. We don't see it as much in water. The Vital Water people are an exception. There's the movement in post-secondary education now against having bottled water. People look at you poorly if you're carrying it around now. We do see it lots in things like, you know, organic juices. And it's not new. Here's an ad from 1962. And that's Libby's cream corn, and it's richer in natural corn cream. That's just a scary thought. What is natural corn cream? Oh. And because it's the end of the term, for me, I've finished marking my exams, even, you know, quality products like Heineken find themselves falling into this. It's a very common theme. There are even marketing agents who will help you make your website look more natural. Right? They make money by getting you to frame your argument in terms of being natural. So, how does this relate to the anti-vaccine movement? Well, sorry. One of the really common anti-vaccine tropes is vaccines are unnatural. right? That, and one of the newest ones has to do with the co-evolution of our pathogens, that we have evolved in company with all of the wonderful things that live on us and around us, and somehow vaccines are upsetting this natural balance between us and the microorganisms that live around and in us. So here's a snippet from a very, very popular alternative medicine naturopath site. That's Mike Adams. For those of you who aren't familiar with him, he's a naturopath kind of guy. He's the health ranger. So if we look at his little slide here, so this is sort of typical argument for him. Most modern vaccinations are, of course, a form of chemical violence against children. Right? Where is it here? The method of introduction of vaccines is unnatural and highly interventionist. So the idea is that we have all these chemical concoctions, as he calls them, and it upsets the natural course of human development by introducing these vaccines into the individual. And if you go look up this particular article, it's funny because it goes on to 9/11 was an inside job and chemtrails and all sorts of other things. Mike really goes crazy on this one. If we think about their argument, right, that getting a disease is natural, and we hear this quite often from anti-vaccine people, it's a form of the naturalistic fallacy. The naturalistic fallacy, essentially in a nutshell, is things that are good. It's the leap from is, something is naturally occurring, to something ought to occur. Right? Because it happens naturally, we ought to let it happen. And things that happen naturally are better. So the argument that's put out there by anti-vaccine types is that natural immunity is best, and that we should get childhood illnesses in order to develop naturally occurring immunity. And we have seen a recurrence of things like pox parties, and people in the US infecting lollipops with chicken pox and passing them out amongst their neighbors, which is kind of scary when you think about it. So if we look at this, right, and we've seen these numbers already today, anytime you make a health or medical decision, right, my argument in my classes is it's always a risk-benefit analysis. Right? You look at the risks, you look at the benefits, and you make some kind of informed decision. There are risks with getting the measles. Right? So about 1 in 10 cases, you get pneumonia, ear infection, or diarrhea. 1 in 1,000 cases ends up with some form of encephalitis, so inflammation of the brain. Of those individuals, 15% die, and 25 to 35% of them are left with some kind of permanent brain damage. If you go around the world, about 1 in 1,000 children who develop measles currently die from their illness. And then the kicker, the one that sneaks up on you, 1 in 4 out of every 100,000 get subacute sclerosing panencephalitis several years after they've been infected. So this is a disease that leads to brain damage, distortion of neural tissue. So it's a risk. And I guess I should say this. Last term, I was teaching my critical thinking component of my class, and I had a student in my class who worked in a chiropractic office. And chiropractors believe that the body has natural healing powers, and that as long as your cervical column is all aligned, that you won't get sick. And she was arguing with me that vaccines were evil and that they could put toxins in people. And when I put up this slide saying that 1 in 1,000 kids who get the measles will die, she said, that's acceptable odds. And I thought, really? 1 in 1,000 is acceptable odds? And she was like, yeah. And I thought, well, you're going to love this then. Because when we look at the vaccine, right, and the risks associated with the vaccine, 5 to 15% of kids who get the vaccine experience a fever. Rarely we see convulsions, not very often. 5% experience a rash around the immunization site. And then, as we've already discussed today, about 1 in a million will we see death as a result of some type of typically allergic reaction or a reaction of the vaccine was done pre-existing medical condition. 1 in 1,000, 1 in a million. The math is pretty simple, right, in terms of your risk-benefit analysis. The Measles Initiative, which hasn't been discussed today, but is an important one, and it's funded by the World Health Organization, the American Red Cross, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which made me forgive Bill for Windows Millennium. It's true, that was a horrible operating system. In 2000, there were 734,000 children killed by measles. That's more than 2,000 kids every day. Right? Yes, mainly in the developing world, about half of those cases were in India. Right? The Measles Initiative started in 2001. From 2000 to 2008, the annual mortality rate for measles dropped from 734,000 per year down to 160. That's just vaccination. There's nothing else that's been changed for these kids. In some regions, like in Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, measles mortality dropped by 90 to almost 95% within the first 7 years of this vaccine initiative. So if you have spare money, the Measles Initiative is a good place to put it. They're still working on things. Okay, so continuing along with the natural fallacy, I have to talk a little bit about the toxin gambit, and this has been brought up already today. The greener vaccines movement, this is the idea, I'm not against vaccines, I just want greener vaccines. This is Jenny McCarthy and the people from the Age of Autism promoting this kind of idea. And typically this gambit works something like, well, they'll list all of the chemicals that are in vaccines, and they talk about them being toxic and unnatural for you. So, these what we have up here. So if you look at number 1 there, there's no safe level for some of these poisons, such as formaldehyde and mercury, even if one of them was consumed or injected on its own. For those of you with any kind of medical training, you know that that's an out-and-out lie, right? I think in the very first week in toxicology, they teach you the dose makes the poison. It's not what you take, but how much of a particular substance. Formaldehyde sounds really bad, and they like that one because most of us have cut up a dead frog at some point and been grossed out by the smell of it, and it brings back that memory of pulling out the entrails and pinning them on the board and stuff. Gross, right? Formaldehyde's a naturally occurring substance. If you didn't have formaldehyde inside of you, well, you'd be dead, right? Because it's part of the metabolization process. You probably get more formaldehyde from your reusable grocery bag than you do from a vaccine. It's in carpet. If you wear permanent press clothes, it's in that. At normal exposure levels, it's non-toxic. So it sounds scary, but not really. The mercury one, we've heard a lot about because of its association with the preservative thimerosal that used to be in the MMR vaccine more than a decade ago. It's no longer in there. In terms of the chemistry of mercury, the mercury that was in the thimerosal, and still is in the thimerosal if you get a flu shot as an adult, it's still in there, it's ethyl mercury. It's non-bioaccumulative. It doesn't build up in your brain. It has a half-life of about 7 days that washes right through your system. It's not methyl mercury, the stuff that's in tuna that accumulates in your brain and creates brain damage. Right? There's more mercury in a tuna sandwich than there are in all of your vaccines combined together. Yeah, I have to hurry. I'm getting tons. So I'm not going to torment you and make you feel sad by challenging you to do that. So So the confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is a naturally occurring phenomenon amongst people. We seek out information that confirms our beliefs, and we ignore the stuff that doesn't. And by example, it's going to illustrate how you do that yourself, but we don't have time for that. Because of the confirmation bias, we tend to ignore or attack evidence that conflicts with our own belief system. And the evolution of the toxin gambit is a really good example of this, right? And how this confirmation bias leads us to move the goalposts. Well, not us, I'm not one of these people, but how these anti-vaccine people do this. So first, vaccines were bad. The MMR vaccine was bad because the measles virus ends up in the gut of the recipient, creates abnormal, atypical polyps in your gastrointestinal system, which creates an autoimmune reaction which causes brain damage. That was Wakefield's original hypothesis. Every step of that process has been falsified. It doesn't work that way. Did they accept that vaccines don't cause autism? Nope. They move on to the mercury hypothesis and looking at thimerosal. We've conducted dozens, not we personally, but scientists have conducted dozens of studies looking at millions of people. There's no connection between vaccines, mercury, and autism. Now it's toxins. The new one's aluminum. Right? That's their new favorite one because aluminum's used as adjuvant in lots of different vaccines. And they claim that aluminum is an evil, scary toxin. I guess they don't use play with dirt because it's one of the most most common elements in the Earth's crust. So every time we falsify their hypotheses, they shift the goalposts. Right? Now it's toxins and it's making a transition to too much too soon. Just discussed before that we just give kids too many vaccines too soon. It's hard to know where these people are going to go, but you can't prove them wrong. You can't falsify their general hypothesis. They refuse to accept the evidence that shows that this connection between vaccines and autism is flawed. Okay, I'm going to do one more, and then I'll cut my talk short at the same time. But the confirmation bias also leads us to the vaccines didn't save us trope. And I want to show it because other people have actually shown these charts today, and I have an interesting angle on this. So lots of anti-vaccine people make the argument that improvements in nutrition, sanitation, and drinking water quality led to health improvements in the 20th century before vaccines came around. The death rate, mortality rate for polio was decreasing before the vaccine was introduced. Right? Because we introduced the iron lung that allowed people with paralysis of the respiratory system to actually survive. Right? So yes, mortality rates were decreasing, but prevalence, the actual amount of the illness happening within the population, didn't decrease until we introduced vaccines. So this is graphical evidence that's often put out there by anti-vax people, showing the incidence of measles decline, and this is a graph of Canadian measles incidence starting in 1935 and coming up to 1983. So this is put out there by a guy named Dr. Raymond, I hate to say his name wrong, Obomsawin. And he's actually a relatively prominent individual in First Nations health initiatives. And you can see from his graph there, back in 1935, we see this sharp decline through the 30s and 40s up to the 50s. And here's the point at which the vaccine was introduced. And so he's arguing that the incidence had declined massively before a vaccine ever came on stream. That's his chart. This is the same data from Health Canada. So measles is a contagious illness. The incidence every year fluctuates, right, when we have episodes of it. But if you look at it, so his graph starts here in 1934, right? And he shows a sharp decline down to this point and then goes across. The data don't map on to his graph. He's lying. He's manufacturing data to present a particular argument. And one of the sad things is that he is a major force in First Nations health initiatives. And one of the areas where vaccination rates are lowest right now in Canada is in First Nations groups. So, take that for what you will. We saw this graph already today. If vaccines didn't save us, what exactly was it that happened in 1964-65 that improved health and sanitation and nutrition that stopped the incidence of measles? We introduce a vaccine, prevalence dies. What other explanation can there be if it's not vaccines? Same thing happens in Canada. And then we see a repeat of that general pattern when the 2-dose program is introduced. So initially you only got one MMR jab, or one measles jab. And in order to provide a booster for that, in 1996 they introduced the 2-dose program. And we saw a significant reduction again in outbreaks of measles. So, I'm not going to go through all these. Yeah, I know, I'm done. We've talked a lot about death in developing nations, right? Because of measles and other illnesses. It's not just the developing world. This is the Jenny McCarthy body count. It's one of my favorite websites. It was introduced after Jenny McCarthy went on Oprah and said that vaccines cause autism. And since that day, we've seen a decrease in the uptake of vaccines in North America. There have been 93,159 vaccine-preventable illnesses in the United States of America, and that's up till April 7th, so pretty recent. 879 deaths from vaccine-preventable illnesses, and 0 cases of autism linked to vaccination. It's a real health problem, and for people who are having kids or who are thinking about vaccinations, you have to weigh the risks and benefits, right? Naturally occurring illnesses are much riskier than the vaccines that we use to protect ourselves against them. I wish I had lots more time to talk about this.